Well, welcome to another Friday night. Hopefully, you're getting used to this online streaming. I'm just, again, very grateful for the opportunity to be able to continue to teach and help people as we work our way through this COVID-19 social distancing. Tonight, we've been in this series talking about places that are dangerous for people in recovery. And it can be an environment, it can be an internal attitude, an internal state that makes them very vulnerable to want to go back to fight, flight, or freeze, which usually leads to relapse. And today we come to one that is very difficult for everybody, but especially for people from complex trauma, and that is having experienced a loss. And we usually think of loss in terms of somebody close to us dying. And what makes that so difficult is that losing somebody precious to us is one of the most painful emotions, the grief emotion. But there's a second part to that, and that is that grief emotions can't be resolved in a day or a week. They can go for years before you're finally able to totally resolve the grief emotion. And so what that means when you talk about losses is that people have to sit in pain as they process and work through and heal from this huge loss. And people from complex trauma don't sit well in very painful emotions because at an early age they learned if you can't resolve a painful emotion, the only way to resolve it is fight, flight, or shut her all down, become hard, freeze. And so learning to sit in grief is very difficult. And so I have talked with hundreds and hundreds of people in recovery, and I asked them to look back over the last years in their recovery when they've been trying to get clean and sober. And I asked them, did your using go up at times when you experienced a fresh new loss? And almost in every case, they say yes, because it takes them to a new level of pain, sends them into fight, flight, and then they relapse. And so what people need to realize is that this is such an important, dangerous area to learn tools for, because you weren't taught those tools at a young age. There's another piece to this, and that is that for a lot of people coming into recovery, they've stuffed losses and their grief for so many years that they've kind of lost touch with it. And so now they need to realize that if they're going to stay clean and sober, at some point they're going to have to begin to resolve the many losses that they just stuffed away and piled up that are going to take them out because they still negatively affect them at times and can be triggered by things they weren't anticipating, and before long they relapse again. And so there's important realization that they have to gradually begin to deal with all of these losses that have been stockpiled. So grief is difficult for every person, but for people from complex trauma, it is especially difficult. In ranking or categorizing people, when it comes to grief, they put three different categories. So there's low risk, and that's basically a person has a good support network and they can work through grief well. They don't need outside professional help. Then there's medium risk, and that is they have an okay support. They have some good tools, but they may need a little bit of help. And then there's high risk. And that is they have almost no tools for dealing with a loss well, and they are going to need lots of help. And everybody basically from complex trauma is in the high risk category. And so that makes it an important thing to learn healthy tools. So what I want to do in this session today is give you an overview of understanding grief and loss and how it affects people, especially from complex trauma, what healing looks like, and some practical tools for healing. Now, I have found that a lot of people from complex trauma have tons of losses, but they're afraid to go there because they're afraid that it's going to stir up too much painful stuff and they won't be able to handle it. That is a legitimate fear. And what I'd say to that is don't begin to deal with losses until you have a healthy support network or a couple healthy people that can walk with you on this journey. And as I share some stuff tonight, it might stir up some stuff. If you don't have supports, please don't go there. Just shut her down, because for you to go there might just be too much. But if you have supports and I stir stuff up, take that as a sign for you, I need to go and get talking about this with my supports. So let's begin with 7 different types of grief. So the first one, and this is key for people in complex trauma because pretty well everybody has it, it's called conflicted grief. And what that means is you're dealing with the loss, the grief emotion, but you have other emotions as well that are very powerful that are conflicting with the grief. So you're not just dealing with one painful emotion, you're dealing with a couple of painful emotions at the same time. So for example, a friend of yours commits suicide. So you are going through the grief emotion of losing your friend, but you're also going through other emotions. You might also be going through some guilt. Why didn't I see the warning signs? Maybe I could have done more. And you're feeling really guilty. Or maybe also you're feeling anger. Why do they get to take the easy way out? Why do they get to do stuff that hurts me and their kids? And so you're going through grief, guilt, anger. 3 very difficult, intense, negative emotions. So that's what we mean by conflicted grief. Some people in addiction have had sexual abuse. And so it might be from a family member. So when that family member dies, part of them is happy that they're finally gone, but part of them is sad. And so they have conflicting emotions inside of them. So conflicted grief. The second one is anticipatory grief. And that is where you anticipate the loss of something in the future. So you might have a friend or a partner that has just been told by the doctors they have severe cancer and they have 6 months to live. So you are anticipating the loss of that partner right now, but it's 6 months away. So you can work through a lot of grief emotions prior to their actual death, but when their actual death comes, you will still go through very intense grief emotions. The third one, traumatic grief. So let's say that you're in a car accident and your friend dies, but you live. So you go through the loss of losing your friend, but you also have to deal with the trauma of that car accident. And so now you have a trauma plus a loss at the same time. And that is a very difficult type of grief to work through. Number 4, vicarious grief. That's when you feel the loss that somebody else is feeling. So let's say your child has just lost their best friend in a car accident. And your child is brokenhearted. They're crying all the time. And you carry your child's loss. You feel their pain and it affects you deeply. You grieve with them. That is vicarious grief. Then there's delayed grief. Another very common thing for people from complex trauma. So let's say you experience a loss, but it doesn't really hit you. Not for a day, a week, a month, a year, but 2 or 3 years down the road, all of a sudden something happens and that loss hits you out of the blue. That was a delayed grief, and those can happen. And then accumulated grief. And that is where you've stuffed all this grief down, loss after loss after loss after loss, and it's accumulated a whole warehouse full of grief that is now sitting there waiting for you. Another common complex trauma type of grief. And then the final one, and it happens with anybody, not just complex trauma, but it's when you go through a period of time where you get one loss after another, back to back to back. And it's just like, wow, one would have been bad, two would have been worse, but they get 4 losses back to back was overwhelming. And so those are the different types of grief. Now let me go through types of losses. So when we think of loss, we usually think of death. And that is probably the most painful type of loss. But there are other types of losses. So let me begin with losses that have to do with relationships. And so that can be death, but it can be other things. So the death of a person you love. And what I found with complex trauma people is they have more grief over grandma or grandpa dying than mom or dad dying. And that's often because mom and dad weren't safe people for them, but grandma or grandpa was. And so grandma and grandpa was more their rock than mom and dad were. And so they have greater grief over grandma. The second one would be if a child goes through the parents getting a divorce. The breakup of the family, the loss of the family relationship, the loss of that family unit. That's a cause of grief. Or when you get older and you go through a breakup, a separation, a divorce, you are losing the person who was once the most important person in your life. The person that you were committed to, that you loved deeply. They're now gone. That relationship is ended. And that is a huge type of loss for people to go through. People that have gone through a miscarriage or an abortion or have found out that they're barren, that they can't have children, all of those are losses. Abortion, where we have found, affects people often in a delayed way and in a great way, often more than they thought it would. Next one, a child that is put into CFS or put up for adoption. They're abandoned. So they lose the family, but they lose the sense of being loved as well and valued. Another one is children who go through frequent moves. So maybe dad moved every 3 or 4 years with his job. And so you just got settled into a neighborhood and a school, and then you moved again and you had to start all over again. You lost all those friends that you had made. And after a while, you get to a new school and you go, I'm not even making friends anymore because it hurts too much to lose them. And you shut down. Another one that parents can go through is the empty nest, when the children leave. And this is particularly difficult for people from complex trauma if the parents got their sense of identity or value from being a parent. And now that the kids are gone, the parent goes, well, what good am I now? Who needs me? Nobody needs me. I have no value. And it can be a very difficult thing. A common one for children with complex trauma is the death of a favorite pet. A dog or a cat is often more painful than the death of a person, because that dog or that cat had unconditional love, was there for them all the time, and so that is a huge loss. Now let me give you one other type of relationship loss, and that's what people begin to realize as they deal with their complex trauma, is that they didn't have something they should have had. They didn't have a loving family with unconditional love. And so they lost something that they didn't have, but they should have had. And that is a very painful loss once you finally realize I didn't get that loving family that children should get. Connected with that is a child that loses their innocence either through sexual abuse or through parents that are addicts, and the child has to grow up and become the parents to their parents. And they don't get to have the innocence of childhood. So those are all relationship type losses. Next one for people in addiction are losses that are due to addiction. And I'll go through these very quickly, but you can lose your health, both your physical and your mental health, due to addiction. You can lose your children. They can get taken from you. You can have parents, family, friends that say, you can't be around here. We're putting boundaries up with you, and you lose your family. You can lose their trust, the trust of other people, the trust of your children. Very painful losses. You can lose your spirituality, your connection with your higher power, your morals and your values that you throw away in order to pursue your addiction. And then with that, you begin to lose self-respect. And all of those, what happens for people in addiction is they're losing more and more as their addiction progresses. Often, they're not even feeling that loss at a conscious level. It's at a subconscious level, but it's building. And once they get into recovery, it hits them as to everything they lost as a result of their addiction. And then you can lose yourself. You don't even know who you are anymore. You can lose your freedom. You can lose your money, your possessions, your career. You can lose potential careers. You can have wasted years. You can lose dreams. And you can lose your reputation. In other words, because of addiction, you can basically lose about everything of value that you had. And when that comes crashing in, that can lead to huge grief and guilt. But it's something that has to be worked through. Then there's a third type of loss, and that is losses due to recovery. Losses due to being clean and sober. And a lot of people don't think about this, but it's an important thing to think about because it will hit you at some point in recovery. Maybe not in the first month or the first few months, but down the road a little bit, these losses will hit you. So number one, you may find in recovery that you can't hang around your family anymore because they're too toxic. So you lose your family, or you lose ever getting their validation, their support that you long to have. You might have to put boundaries up with your partner or your friends. You may have to end some relationships because they're not good for you. And those are losses due to being clean and sober. There may come times where you miss the lifestyle, the high, the chaos, all the party atmosphere. You might begin to miss. You will at times miss, when you're in pain, having your favorite way of coping available to you because it's now not available. And therefore, you will miss the privilege, as you might think it, of not feeling these painful emotions, of having a way to numb all of these painful emotions. And you just got to sit in some of this stuff. You may get to a point where you get tired of being a responsible adult and you miss being an addict where you didn't have to do responsibilities and be accountable to anybody. Young people often, when they get clean and sober, down the road they begin to miss not being able to drink socially with their friends. And that is a hard pill for them to swallow. Some people, when they were in the problem, they got their identity in the problem. And they were looked up to in the problem. And now they don't have an identity. They don't know who they are. The things that used to get respect, now they can't do. And so they lose all of those things that gave them a sense of value. Huge losses. So that's just a bit of an overview of possible losses. What I get clients to do when I teach this is to make a timeline. And so it's timeline of your life, 0, 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, and then go through that list of losses and mark on that timeline every one of those losses that applies to you when it happened. And then I get them to mark the severity or the intensity of the pain around that loss. So you might have some losses where you say, that's a 10. That was the most painful loss of my life. Others, that was a 6. It was painful, but it wasn't super, super painful. And then begin to get a look at your life in light of the losses of your life. And that can be a very helpful and insightful thing for people. Now let me take you to the next thing. We have discovered that grieving is a process. It is not something that happens quickly overnight. It is something that takes time, and as you go through it, you go through different stages in the process. And so it's been called the grieving process. I want to go through that very quickly with you to help you understand what it is and the path to healing, what it might look like. I want to say not everybody follows this path identically. You may go back and forth. You may miss the steps. You might get them in different orders. All of those things can happen. And what most people also find is that they will go through this process many times in the healing process. And I'll explain that more in a minute. And then complex trauma people tend to get stuck at certain parts or places in this process. And I'll point those out as we go. So the number one is shock, denial, numbness, disbelief. It's your brain can't quite get its head around what has just happened, what you've just lost. And so you walk around kind of stunned, like a deer in the headlights. It hasn't totally sunk in yet. This numbing is part of how your brain handles the initial pain. The problem for complex trauma people is they want to stay there. And this is where many people relapse because they don't want to feel, they don't want reality to set in. So that takes us to the second one. Reality begins to set in. And it affects us emotionally in a whole bunch of different ways. It affects our thinking, our thought life, and it affects our actions. So I want to start with the emotions, because that's what we usually connect with loss. So the first emotion that usually we begin to feel as reality sets in is the painful grief emotion. Mourning, sadness. For some, lots of crying. For some, a deep depression. Life is no longer worth living. It is a very, very painful thing. Now let me just say this. Some get stuck here. And they feel they have to be stuck here. They feel that if they were ever in 2 years from now to laugh again, to joke around, that would be saying they don't miss this person anymore. And so they feel guilty if they ever have fun or laugh. And so they feel they have to remain stuck in this gripping sadness for the rest of their life. Some go to the emotion of hopelessness. And again, it's how can I survive without this person? What's the point? And then some can slide into the emotion of self-pity. It goes from the sorrow of missing that person to poor me. And that can be a dangerous place. The next emotion that is the most powerful besides the grief is anger. And anger is a correct emotion whenever we lose something valuable to us. We're mad that we've lost it. We don't feel we should have lost it maybe. And so that anger is normal. It's not wrong. You might have been punished for being angry when you lost something, but that, I want you to understand, is part of the normal grieving process. But what can happen is that people can get stuck in anger. They like anger because then if they're angry, they don't feel the grief pain. If they're angry, it gives them energy. But what they find is that anger begins to cause them to lash out, be negative, and they can lash out at those they love. They can blame people. They can lash out at God. It can be becoming this very, very angry person, which isn't a good thing. Now we go to the brain. Grief affects our thinking. And so we begin to ask questions. Why did this happen? What if I had done this? What if I had done that? And our brain can process that over and over again, looking for answers. I find that people who are very analytical can get stuck here. Part of their brain thinks I can't move on unless I figure it all out. And so I have to answer every question that I have about the why. I have to explore every possible what if in order for me to finally relax my thinking. I have to find some great cosmic purpose for this loss if I'm ever going to move on. And so they can be stuck there for a long time. But after you go through the emotions, after you go through all of that thinking, the goal is that you eventually come to a place where you begin to accept the loss. Now, this is important to understand because acceptance tends to take place in layers. So here's what I mean. Let's say you have lost a child and you have grieved and you're starting to get to a point where you accept the loss of that child, and then Christmas hits. And it's just like the loss you feel at a deeper level all over again. And then their birthday hits, and then you're grieving all over again. And so what we have found is that people have to go through at least a year, through all the seasons, through all the anniversaries and special occasions, because every season, special occasion, anniversary is going to impact them again about the loss, and they have to go through the cycle again. And so they may go back to great sadness and hopelessness and what ifs and whys all over again. And that is but every time you go through, you accept it a little bit deeper. You accept it a little bit deeper. And that is part of what the healing is. And so that's why many say that the second year can be the hardest. Because now you're finally at a place of acceptance. There's not some part of you still hoping to get them back, etc. And it settles in that you are not going to have them, and that can be very difficult. So, for somebody very close to you, it can take 2 to 3 years to go through this healing, grieving process. And once you've gone through it and accepted it, doesn't mean you never feel pain about that person. You still feel pain when you think of them, but it doesn't paralyze you the way it used to. You're able now to live with that pain being triggered. So the goal of all of this, acceptance, is eventually you come to a point of resilience where you can reinvest, you can let go, you can move on without that person. And again, that can be 2 years, 3 years. Hard to say. Some people can do it more quickly than others, but that is the goal. And so when you finally get to the point of being able to move on, being able to have fun again, be able to enjoy life again, that can feel very weird. That can almost make you feel guilty. And you have to work through some of those feelings as you begin to move on. And you still can have stuff get triggered, which can take you back into going through the grieving process all over again. But it is possible to heal from deep loss. It is possible to move on. And it is possible that that loss can make you a stronger, better person than you were before the loss happened. And I hope that helps you. Now let me just end by giving you some tools. We teach a whole week at React on grief because it's such a big topic. It's such an important topic. But here's some of the things that just to highlight what we would teach. Number one, we would emphasize that everybody grieves differently. Some people are very emotional, expressive, cry a lot. Others, they retreat inward and become very silent. Others want people around them helping them grieve. Others need to grieve more alone. And so that becomes an issue if you're in a relationship, because it's very likely your partner doesn't grieve like you do. And so that can cause conflict because they might think you're not grieving properly because you're not doing it like they are. And so the rate of divorce goes up when families, couples are grieving something together because of the extra tension that it involves. So be aware of what your own grieving style is. Come to learn that in your own life. Secondly, most everybody cannot grieve totally alone. There's parts of grieving we have to do alone, but there's parts where we need people. And so it is very important to have safe people that you can spend time with, cry with, process with, just hang out with to help you through this process. Beware of having people who want to come and fix you and cheer you up with cliches that are really maddening when you stop and think of some of the cliches. Oh, it's going to get better, and God just needed another angel, and all of those kind of things. Watch out for those people because they'll just make you messed up even more. Next one, there are so many different possible support groups now available for people grieving the loss of a child, people grieving the loss of a partner, people grieving the loss of a marriage. Find support groups. Don't be afraid to go for counseling. There are lots of very good books on grieving. Read some books. They will help you get through this. They are very important. Most people, when they come to letting go, part of the grieving process is to have a ritual, a memorial type event where you say goodbye. Some people have done that by writing a letter to the person as their way of just saying goodbye. Others have let balloons go. Others have done it through a funeral service. But if that would be helpful for you, that's okay. Have your own little ritual. That's your way of letting go. And then, if this person was a positive person in your life, make a book of memories. Write down things that will help you. Just remember the blessing they were to you in your life, and that will help you in the days ahead. Next, you're going to need boundaries. Tell people what you need. Tell people what you don't need. If people just show up at your house, you don't have to let them in. If you're not there yet, you can say, come back another day, or call first. Figure out what you're going to need to get through this, and then set the appropriate boundaries, because some are going to be pushy. Some are going to be assuming they know what's best for you, and you need to be able to figure out what's best for you, proper self-care, and begin to set boundaries that would correspond with that. So for you, watching COVID-19 has probably already brought some losses to your life. Maybe people, but definitely things, activities, etc. I hope that this overview just gives you some good help, some tools, understanding that will help you deal with the losses that you're facing. That's the end of part one. I'm going to take a 1-minute break, and then we're going to come back for part two, which is the Christian part. And if you're not interested in staying around for that, thank you for being here for the first part. Well, welcome back for the Christian part. And we're come to the end of our little study in Israel coming out of slavery, their own complex trauma. And so I'm hoping that this has been a very helpful series for you. I've really enjoyed teaching it and studying it. I want to go on next time with some other stories shortly after all of this that will just fill in some extra pieces for you. But we've got the next generation ready to move into the promised land. Their parents came to the promised land, listened to the 10 spies who were negative, said, we're not going there. God said, okay, you can all die in the desert. And now their children are standing with Joshua on the edge of the promised land. And the question that comes to my mind is, what instruction is God going to give them? So he's talked to their parents now. They probably heard some of that. But what is he going to emphasize with them? What does he want them to hear? And as I looked at this question, what I realized is it paralleled recovery. Because they're kind of going into their new life just like a person is going into the new life of recovery. And the instructions that God emphasizes are fascinating because they are so appropriate for somebody coming into a new life of recovery. And they focus around two things. Number one, God is going to emphasize the importance of healthy boundaries and the importance of healthy relationships. It is very, very powerful. So let me just read the first scripture that God gives to this next generation. In Numbers 33, when you cross the Jordan River, and so that was the mark, the dividing line where Israel started. When you cross the Jordan River into the land of Canaan, which was the promised land, you must drive out all the people living there. You must destroy all their carved and molten images, that's their religious idols, and demolish all their pagan shrines. Take possession of the land and settle in it, because I have given it to you to occupy. But if you fail to drive out the people who live in the land, those who remain, so the ones you allow to stay alive, they will be like splinters in your eyes and thorns in your sides. In other words, constant painful aggravations. They will harass you in the land where you live. So basically God is saying, these people are like a cancer. These people are toxic. These people are very unhealthy. Do not try to develop a relationship with them. Do not take on any of their practices. So their whole religious system was built around sex with temple prostitutes. And so God is saying you have to set a boundary with them. Do not do any of their lifestyle and don't let them live. And then in Deuteronomy 7, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are about to enter and occupy, he will clear away many nations ahead of you. When the Lord your God hands these nations over to you and you conquer them, you must completely destroy them. Same message. Make no treaties with them. Show them no mercy. You must not intermarry with them. Do not let your daughters and sons marry their sons and daughters, for they will lead your children away from me to worship other gods. So let me summarize kind of two key things that God is saying. He says you have to be careful when you're going into a new life to not have negative influences around you, negative forces to remain or become part of your life. Don't make any compromises. Don't adopt or go back to any aspects of the old life that were bad for you. What he is saying, and this is what I want to emphasize, is this. There will be toxic people. You will need severe boundaries with them. You do not let them into your life for a second. Now, for a lot of people, if their toxic people are their families or past friends, if they were to cut them out of their life, they would go, that feels so mean, that feels cruel, that feels hard. Maybe I'll just kind of put up with them, or maybe I'll compromise a little bit and tolerate them. And that's what God is warning about. Now, let me just say this. I've been doing this for a long time now, and not everybody in recovery needs to cut their family out of their life. In fact, I would say probably only 10% of the people, maybe a bit more than 10%, need to totally cut family out of their life. They're that toxic. Most can still have a relationship, but it has to have very strict, clear boundaries. But what I want you to hear is this. Some people do have to have that severe kind of boundary. There's a second place where a severe boundary is necessary. When many people come into recovery, they just want to be nice to everybody. And so I'm going to take, for an example, a young woman who's very pretty. All the guys take an interest in her. All of a sudden she feels like there's all these predators around her. And you say that guy's not good for you. You can't even say hi to them. Oh, but that would be mean. And then the person wants to phone them and get their phone number to text them and take them out for coffee. And they're afraid to say no because they are afraid to be rude. And I go, please, you have to do this, because if you don't, you will regret it. And I have had so many people come back and say, I wish I had set that firm boundary because that person really messed me up. They became a thorn in my side. So there will be, in recovery, times, maybe not a lot, but there will be times where you have to have an extreme boundary. I would say don't set an extreme boundary till you've talked to somebody who knows your situation well, who has experience and wisdom in this field, in this area, so that they can be with you through this and help you make those very hard decisions. But there's a second piece here. Why is so much emphasis put on don't intermarry? I think what God is doing is recognizing this. When a person sees somebody else who's very pretty, who's hot, it triggers their limbic brain. And their limbic brain says, wow, there can't be anything wrong with them. They're so pretty. And they put rose-colored glasses on and ignore warning signs. And they get drawn into the relationship based on appearances and limbic brain. And we don't do due diligence to check out that this is a healthy person. And what God is saying is this. Don't let your limbic brain trump due diligence to check a person out. Because that is so easy to happen. And it happens all the time. And what he is going beyond that to say is this. The key thing where you need to have intimacy for a relationship to work is not physical. It's not we have things in common. It is spiritual intimacy. Do we at the deepest level share the same passion, the same values, the same beliefs? Because if you get in an intimate relationship with somebody who doesn't share your deepest values and passions, who's on a different page at the most critical topic, it could drag you away from a healthy place. And that's what God is warning them about. It is so subtle. It seems so innocent. oh yeah, we're kind of on the same page, but not totally. But I think I can handle it. And I'm just going to follow my limbic brain and pursue this because they're really pretty. And before you know it, you're drifting from your base, your rock solid core. And it can really mess you up. And so God is saying, watch out for that. So let me take you to the book of Judges. So Israel comes out. Joshua, the book of Joshua, is them conquering the promised land. And then Judges starts, once the land has been conquered, it picks up the story from there. So in Judges 1, here's just a few verses. The Lord was with the people of Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they failed to drive out the people living in the plains who had iron chariots. And then a couple verses down, remember there are 12 tribes, so the first verse was the people of Judah, that's the tribe of Judah. Secondly, the tribe of Benjamin, however, failed to drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. Next, the tribe of Manasseh failed to drive out the people living in Bethshan. And I could keep going, but every tribe failed to drive out, like God told them to do, the people in their territory. So I go, why? There are two kind of reasons that are given. Number one, remember that iron chariots? It would be really hard to drive those people out. They had battle technology. They had weapons. They had stuff that was beyond what Israel had. And so to drive them out would have taken a lot of work. So it was easier just to learn to coexist. Do you want to know what's going to happen in recovery? You're going to make some changes, and you're going to make some changes early on that are quite easy. But then you're going to get to your core issues. And to drive out those issues and change in those areas, those deep-seated, long-standing habits, is going to be a war. And I watch many people, they do a lot of changing in the early days of recovery on the easy stuff. But once they get to the core, the most difficult battles, they go, too difficult, I'll just learn to coexist. And it's a disaster. The second thing that we get in almost every one of those, and I didn't read them, but it says instead of driving them out, and they could have, they made them slaves. And that to me is fascinating. Because what I think it's saying is this. The people have conquered that land, and they have got to a place where they have defeated most of the people, and they said, we're tired of fighting. We want an easier life now. You know what? We could have a really easy life if we made people slaves. And then they could work for us for nothing. And we could become wealthy. And we could be on easy street. I'm tired of working hard. I'm tired of fighting. Let's make these people slave. A matter of convenience. Do you realize, or something I took a while to realize in my life, is that even though I live in a country of peace where there's a fairly easy lifestyle, there will be a part of my life that will include warfare until the day I die. Warfare against temptations, old habits, warfare, opposition from others. Part of me always wants to have an easy life. But part of me has to accept that that's never going to happen if I continue to follow God's design. But some people get to a point where they go, let's just tolerate these people because I can use them. Let's not get rid of mom and dad, even though they're super toxic, because they still give me money and they babysit for free. So let's just use people to make my life better. And that is what Israel did. So let me take you to Judges chapter 2. So Judges chapter 1 gave you the report card of that second generation, the one that went into the promised land. Now in Judges 2, we're told about their children, the third generation. So it says, after that generation died, the second generation that went into the promised land, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things he had done for Israel. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight and served the images of Baal. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. Wow. That second generation, they let some stuff continue to exist that God told them they would regret if they did, that God said will really mess you up. And now we see what's happened. Their children don't even hardly know about God. Their children have no interest in following God because they have been taken over by that culture that was allowed to continue that God told them to get rid of. You know, many people, when they come into recovery, they want to get clean and sober for the sake of their kids. When they begin to realize about complex trauma and they see the complex trauma that they've created for their kids, they have all kinds of guilt. But then they go, I want to change. For me. But I want to change so that my kids don't have to go down the road I did. So that their life can change that. But do you realize that if you stop growing, if you come to a point where you say, I'm tired of working so hard, I'm tired of fighting all these battles, I'm just going to let some of this old stuff still hang around, you could be screwing up your kids. That's what happened with Israel. And so, what we then find in the book of Judges is that next generation that forgot against God. Do you know what began to happen? They got so messed up that nations came in and started conquering them and making them slaves. So they could talk about their grandparents who were slaves in Egypt, who came out of Egypt, their parents who came into a promised land, and now where are they today? Slaves just like their grandparents. So sad. Such a tragic, tragic ending to this story. I hope, though, that it just helps you to be resolved, to say, I can't quit fighting. I gotta keep dealing with this stuff. I can't just let it exist in my life because it'll mess me up and my kids. Let's pray. Father, I just find this story so sad, but yet I'm thankful it's in the Bible because it is such an important one for us to be confronted with. And I just pray for those listening tonight that you will just work in their heart where they need to be working. Just shine the spotlight on things that maybe they've been tolerating that they shouldn't, where they've been making compromises when they shouldn't, where they've let down their boundaries. Help them, give them the strength and the courage to do what is necessary and just be very real to them in these choices, I pray. Amen. Well, thank you again for tuning in and being part of this. I just again hope that tonight has been a very helpful thing for you, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.